Episode 1 of the Daddyless Issues podcast. The title of this episode is A Daddyless versus a Fatherless Child, the Missing Piece and the Ghetto DNA Test. Welcome to the Daddyless Issues podcast. I'm your host, Dante Brown. Thanks for being here with me. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about the truth. It's going to be raw, and we're going to talk about hope and forgiveness. So if you're not ready for the real, I hope you'll get ready. So you may be asking yourself, why is this dude doing a podcast talking about daddyless issues? Well, I'm glad you asked. Daddyless is a real thing. It's real to me because I grew up, without my dad for 13 years of my life, and it caused me some real issues. When I was young, I didn't realize how impactful his absence was. The saying, you can't miss something you never had. But in this situation, all the things that I missed created a void, an emptiness that I sought to fill. I've come to realize that I have some real issues related to him not being in my life for so many of my early years. So I wanted to create a platform for us to talk about these quote unquote daddy issues. But I guess it's more like those lack of daddy issues. So this podcast is kind of like my therapy. And this is not to say I'm a licensed therapist. I'm not. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm an expert in this field because I have 13 years of on-the-job experience. And this is one of those, situations where you don't want to be an expert in this particular position, right? Because nobody wants to be without their dad. But most of all, I hope that this podcast is going to be helpful, for people to identify their daddy issues, their daddyless issues. In my opinion, the issue of children growing up without their father is one of the most important problems that we face in our society today. And I hope that through this podcast, we can identify some of those issues that stem from being quote unquote daddyless and discuss some of the possible ways that we can deal with our issues and hopefully heal. So let's start by discussing the void that's left behind when a dad is physically, spiritually, or emotionally absent. There is a PIECE piece to the puzzle of our lives that's missing because he wasn't there. And I'm hopeful that through our discussions, we'll find some PEACE piece by discussing our stories, exploring real solutions, and gaining, healing through forgiveness, and in some cases, reconciliation. For me, the formula has been forgiveness plus healing equals peace. And I believe that many of you are looking for that same peace. A dad's love and protection is so important to our development. And, when that's missing, there's a void that's left in their offspring. And it's extremely difficult to fill it. And in most cases, it never is. So we need to understand that him being absent creates a hole in us that in many cases we try to fill. And that's those issues that I'm going to talk about. Okay. So as you've noticed, the title of this podcast is Daddylessness or Daddyless Issues and not Daddy Issues. Don't get me wrong. Many of the problems that we're facing or dealing with are quote unquote daddy issues. The kind of problems that have women, who have issues with their dads, get on the stripper pole or become adult film stars. Yeah, those. Or the types of issues that lead men to become womanizers or abusers and deadbeats. But in my opinion, these daddy issues are the result of men not being dad, but just father. And these issues are prevalent, because he was absent or abusive in some way. Here's why I call them daddyless and not fatherless. For me, there's a difference between a dad and a father. A dad is present. He leads by example. He nurtures, provides, protects, loves, and cares for his children. He doesn't neglect or abuse them. He's someone to be emulated and followed. And, essentially he takes responsibility for his kids. But on the other hand, a father, technically that's a sperm donor. A man is given the title of father just for having sex and having a child born as a result of it. And that's the least that a man can do. So I look at it like this, like when my kids were small, When I would come home from work, they wouldn't scream, "Father, Father," when I walked through the door. No, they scream "Daddy," because that's what I am. I'm not just a father. I don't call children fatherless children. Everyone has a father. We were and are daddyless, and that's what we should be called. When a father is absent, either physically, emotionally, or spiritually, they leave their children daddyless. And some people may disagree, but that's my opinion, and there's a difference. Let's also talk about family for a minute. The traditional family consisted of a mother and a father. But let's be clear, as I said, not all fathers are dads. And in my opinion, a dad is one of the most important roles I've ever had in my life. And I know that many men feel the same way. So family is important to me, but the question of what constitutes a family can vary from person to person. But at minimum, it takes a woman and a man to create a child. So what makes a family is not just determined by having a baby, right? The fact is the child doesn't make a family. But at the same time, the absence of a father doesn't dismantle a family, but the impact of his absence can have and do a considerable amount of damage. So the pivotal question is, does there have to be a man or a dad present in order for children to be raised right? Does the absence of a father change everything, or is he even necessary? Is he needed in order for there to be a quote unquote family, in your opinion? Let me know in the comments. Hopefully you can see that this daddyless issue is universal. It transcends race, class, ethnicity, color, everything. So it's not just isolated to one group or another, not one race or another. All the groups in our society are affected by this daddyless problem. So now that we've established that, or what daddylessness is, let's talk about some of the issues that arise as a result of him being absent. There is this lingering trauma, the trauma related to these unhealthy and dysfunctional relationships, or a lack of a relationship with our fathers. And it can create psychological and emotional difficulties that remain with us for years. And this trauma creates these daddy issues, these daddyless issues. Things like trust. We are distrustful. There is a lack of trust. We have difficulty believing what people say or promise. And this results in us avoiding dependency to prevent being hurt, probably because of many of the broken promises that may have been made by our fathers. Then there's the insecurity. There's the uncertainty and anxiety. We have a lack of confidence, and this results in us avoiding close relationships. Then there's those people who have those abandonment issues. Oh my gosh. The fear of being abandoned, more anxiety, and we may be clingy, and we worry about people leaving us behind. Then we have these difficulties setting boundaries because we want approval. We have difficulty saying no, which can cause us to be in codependent relationships. We have these repetitive, unhealthy relationship patterns, one bad relationship after another. And this is primarily due to the fact that we may not have had any good, healthy relationship role models. So we just wing it and fail miserably, especially if you were in a relationship with somebody who had a positive relationship role models to follow. Then there's this emotional instability, these anger issues, these mood swings we have, this difficulty regulating our emotions. And many times we will overreact. Then we long for love, this deep emotional void and yearning for love, even from the wrong people, which sometimes lends itself to the next issue, which is sexual promiscuity. And this is connected to that longing for love topic, like I just mentioned. And we interpret physical intimacy for emotional intimacy. We tend to mistake sex for actual love. This promiscuity is also connected to unhealthy relationship patterns as well, because if sex is taken off the table, in many cases, the relationship is over. This promiscuity may also contribute to the perpetuation of the daddyless cycle. Then there are the low self-esteem issues or the low self-worth, always looking for validation, needing approval to fill this emotional void. And for some, there is a need to be overachievers in order to show their value, to build their confidence. Then there's the identity crisis. We lack a knowledge about a whole other side of us. which can definitely lead to issues. The identity crisis that we have, the perpetuation of the daddyless cycle. Without positive relationship role models or good examples to show us and follow, many of us follow the patterns that have already been established. I call them the generational curses. These are some of the issues we are going to be addressing in coming episodes. But I think it's extremely important for us to understand that many of these issues have extremely destructive outcomes for some of us. And it's very important that we're able to identify them. These issues have been known to result in suicides and homicides, being in and staying in abusive relationships, or people being abusers themselves. So my focus is to help identify these issues as early as possible so that you can begin the journey of addressing them head on. Now that we've established what daddyless issues are, I want to shift our attention to the other topic of this episode, and that being what I call the puzzle. So for me and many other daddyless children, our father's absence has created a void, a missing piece to the puzzle of our lives. In fact, I wrote about this emptiness in my book, Motive or Motivation. And in the beginning of the book, I wrote a poem entitled The Puzzle. This poem is an expression of my feelings about being without my dad for technically more than 13 years at the beginning of my life. So some of you may be able to relate to this poem. And it goes like this. Yesterday, I woke up and realized I was a man. No one was there to guide me, and I didn't understand what it meant or how to be or what was all involved. I knew this was a puzzle that one day I need to solve. I looked at what made up my life and all that it had been, exploring all the different things that changed us boys to men. I examined who I'd come to be, the turns that brought me here. The pieces just don't seem to fit, confirming my worst fear. The thing that I had feared the most was right there in my face. The fear of failing as a man, the stigma of my race, portrayed as deadbeat dads and losers who refuse to work, or criminals and thugs and pimps, or simply outright jerks who abuse and hurt our women and abandon our kids and try to show up and play dad in between the jailhouse beds. But what about me? The man I am, confused about my role? I paid the cost to be the boss, but forgot to pay the toll? There is no way this is not true. I've stepped up to the plate. I've done the things my dad did not, and I wasn't 13 years late. Guess what I'm trying to say, and in no way am I dissing, but how can you complete this puzzle when there's a piece that's missing? The piece that I'm referring to is essential to be a man, and many men deny this fact and proceed the best they can to go through life without this piece, but the puzzle's incomplete. Some do learn to live without, and others simply compete, but still there will remain a void. No matter how hard you try, you'll always wonder what made him leave, and you still want to know why. But as I pondered and thought it through, exploring who I am, I wondered, since my dad was gone, if he really gave a damn. Since he wasn't there to guide me through most of my early years, he wasn't there to comfort me, to wipe away my tears. He wasn't there for my first hit or my first football game. And I wonder, if he had been there, would my life have been the same? I couldn't have told you where he lived or the kind of work he does. I could have walked right by the man and wouldn't have known who he was. You may be quite dysfunctional and you don't know what to do. The things you see your father do all help to make you you. As complex as this thing may be, you may not ever know that all the things you hear and see are the things that help you grow. But if you never hear from him, you cannot emulate the things he does, the things he says, the ways he may be great. But then again, the things you miss may make you better still, because you won't pass on his faults and leave a void unfilled. For some, the chance to meet their dad may come with great elation. The fact that he wasn't always there can be a motive or a motivation. Writing, for me, has been very therapeutic. It helped me with my journey of healing. And it may be beneficial for some of you to take the time to write down your feelings. It may allow you to open up some of those doors that you've closed for so many years. It may allow you to express your feelings about him, your hurts, and your healing. Allow yourself to be open about how you feel about how you grew up. The things you missed about him not being there, or the void you feel in your heart. Give it a try. It may be helpful, because it's been helpful for me in my journey. Now, let's talk about my first meeting with my dad. And I do call him dad now. because he became my dad. That was a part of the process, a part of my journey to subsequently call him dad. I also want to speak about what I call this ghetto DNA test. As I mentioned in the poem, I was daddyless until I was 13 years old when I finally met my father. Before that, my father was like a mythical character, like a minotaur or like Bigfoot. I would hear about him through people claiming to be related to him or me on his side. And, there would be alleged sightings of him at times throughout the years by people who knew him or by my mom, but I didn't even know what he looked like. So our first meeting was really awkward. And like I said, I call it the ghetto DNA test. I literally didn't know what my father looked like, talked like, where he worked, lived, anything. Some of you may be able to relate to this. I could have walked right by the man and wouldn't have known who he was. So at 13 years old, I told my mom I was ready to meet my father. Now, as a sidebar, I don't know why my mom left it up to me to decide when I would meet my father. In my opinion, this was an adult decision that, should not have been left up to a child to decide. So by the time I was 13, I already had established some really hard feelings about him. And at the time, I'd already concluded that I didn't need him in my life. I built up a good deal of resentment and anger towards him because, he hadn't been there. He'd been absent. So we had been struggling for, so many years, and we were poor for so long. I figured his presence really didn't make any difference to me either way. So when I decided to meet him, it was more out of curiosity than it was to build a long-lasting relationship with him. And honestly, at the time, I felt like, he must not be too good of a person since, to my knowledge, he hadn't made any effort to try to meet me and be a part of my life any sooner. So on this day, this day was kind of a chilly fall night, actually. The kind of night when you first turn your heat on in your house and you kind of warm and cozy. But this night didn't feel that way. It felt kind of cold and I was anxious and really nervous. But my mom, she had set up this meeting. There was a knock at the door and she told me to go and open it. She knew my father was coming, so I was like, all right. I opened up the door and there were two men standing outside. And since we didn't have an outside light and it was dark, I couldn't see the men's faces initially, so I wasn't able to make out what they really looked like. My mom stood there and told me to let them in. I did. Told them to come in. At that point, the lighting was a little bit better, and we all stood there for what seemed like an eternity, looking one another up and down, trying to find some resemblance. Then my mom said, this is your father, Frank. But to be honest, I still didn't know which one of them was my dad. I didn't know who she was talking about. Then one of the men said, Frank, he's got Raphael's ears. And at that point, the burning question I had in my head about which one of them was my father got answered. Anyway, the other guy turned out to be my father's cousin. So after that, we sat down, we talked about where I went to school, what grade I was in, a bunch of other stuff that I didn't necessarily feel was too significant. But turns out, I had a brother and two sisters on his side of the family. So that was a pleasant surprise because, I hadn't had any sisters. And the person whose ears mine resembled were my half-brother Raphael's. Come to find out, he was murdered before I even had an opportunity to meet him. But like I said, I was glad I now knew I had two sisters because I hadn't had any before. My mom had all boys. Anyway, the night ended with him giving me his number and telling me we would keep in touch, which we did until he died in 2020. And come to find out, he was a really good guy. I really got to know him, not as deeply as I would have liked, but I got to talk to him and be around him even before he passed away. So I call him dad and not just a father. Now, the thing that I remember the most about the day that we met, though, was this whole initial authenticity process of being looked up and down for some resemblance. This review examination process had a significant impact on me. It was like as if as a daddyless child, just like many others, we had to be examined to determine if we were the genuine article, the real thing or some knockoff like a fake Gucci bag or something like that. It made me feel cheap and less valued. And as a result, I coined the term for this inspection process that I and many other children have had to go through. I call it the Ghetto DNA test. You know how it's done. Usually it happens when a baby is taken to see or a picture shown to a boy or man's mother, grandmother, auntie, or another family member, or in some cases, even a friend, and they conduct this examination of the child. The baby is probed for some resemblance of the alleged father. He looks like you. She's got your ears, nose, forehead, birthmark, walk, talk, laugh, or something that they think either runs in the family or is related to the alleged father. So how do you think that this scrutiny can make a child of a reasonable age feel? You're not cattle. You're not a piece of meat or subpar quality, right? You're a child. This is extremely humiliating and embarrassing if you are of age to understand it. Especially if the people who are doing the examination come back and say, well, I don't see any resemblance, or they deny one even exists. So obviously these determinations can be subject to any bias that these individuals might have against the mother or even the family of the baby. So is it really reliable after all? I'll talk about it some more in another episode. So that's my ghetto DNA test story. What about you? Or what about your child? If you've been the subject of a ghetto DNA test, submit your comments. Tell me your story. So the embarrassment of the ghetto DNA test was just part of my journey and understanding that my situation wasn't necessarily normal. I was a kid, so I didn't know that there were tons of other kids like me. But for me, I felt like it wasn't normal. It was definitely different than those circumstances where, paternity had already been established and a dad had already been involved. So I did understand that to some extent. I really started to recognize the difference between my family and those families that had a dad present and involved, though. I had cousins who had their father and their mother. So I was different. My family was different. And my feelings got amplified when I realized that due to his absence, and I'm not blaming him fully, but, we were on welfare and we had to go to charity to get clothes for school. In fact, there was this particular charity, I remember it vividly. It's called Charity Newsy. It's in Columbus, Ohio. Shout out to them for taking care of us and so many other needy kids. I don't even know if it still exists, but they would give out clothes to the needy kids every year. Since my father wasn't there and my mother only had an 11th grade education and no real job, we were poor. Living in the projects was embarrassing and dangerous for me. One of the most embarrassing things for me, especially during our time in the projects, was having to go to the grocery store with food stamps to get my mom a pack of Benson & Hedges menthol cigarettes. This was one of the first instances where I recognized we had to struggle, and it had something to do with our dads not being around. As most of you know, you can't buy cigarettes with food stamps. So if you were going to buy them, you first had to spend a small amount from each of the dollars that you had in order to get enough coins back to buy the cigarettes. So breaking down the food stamps to get enough coins to buy the cigarettes was time consuming. And I was already worried about some of my neighbors or school friends seeing me spending food stamps in the first place. So having to stand there and do this process was really nerve-wracking. So while I was breaking down the food stamps, I was always looking over my shoulder to see who was behind me in line. I didn't want to get caught or be caught as the kid who had the food stamp. I thought if somebody saw me, I was going to get clowned by everybody at the school or even in the neighborhood. And needless to say, I hated going to the store with the food stamps. Mind you, if you really think about it, we lived in the projects. So the vast majority of my classmates and friends lived there too. So most likely they were on welfare. But, as a 7 or 8 year old, you don't realize that. So living in the projects and being on welfare was my first indicator that the absence of my father made us different. My feelings did get amplified later on at times when, he was supposed to be there and he wasn't. Things like church plays, musical recitals at school, parent-teacher conferences at school, birthdays, my first heartbreaks and other activities where dad was supposed to be there and he wasn't. These were the moments that his absence spoke the loudest. So, as I mentioned, we were poor and I grew up in some of the roughest neighborhoods in Columbus, Ohio. For example, we lived in Poindexter Village, like I said, those projects. And if you know anything about the projects, these are areas traditionally they have, high crime and poverty. And, this particular project was built in the 1940s. It was one of the first housing projects in Columbus and one of the first in the United States. And I could just tell you that this project produced some people who committed SAs and bank robberies, pimps and prostitutes, hustlers, even people who made people unalive. And that's not to say that these types of people aren't everywhere, but just picture them consolidated into a few square blocks. But yet and still, it produced people like me who became lawyers, doctors, accountants, and writers. In a lot of cases, we were considered the exception and not the rule. Overall, though, one of the predominant circumstances I saw in our project was single mothers and no daddies to be found. Statistically, only 3% of subsidized housing programs serve 2 adults with children. Think about that for a minute. And the data also shows that the absence of a father in a household lends itself to poverty that is passed down from generation to generation. Think about that for a minute. It's like a generational curse. And we'll talk about some of those generational curses related to the daddylessness in later episodes. But the fact that the subsidy programs were created to only assist mothers with children in so many ways became a disincentive for there to be a family unit. And it, in fact, promoted the absence of fathers. So think about how it is when you have a person who only has one income. Without 2 incomes, there's a greater likelihood that poverty is going to follow. 1 in 4 people in our society are living in poverty. And much of this is due to fathers not being there to assist in providing for their families as they should. So I know what it's like to be poor. Do I blame my dad for our circumstances? Yeah and no. Obviously, life would have been somewhat different for me if there would have been more money in our household. And I believe if my father was present or contributing, there would have been fewer nights that I had to go to bed hungry, because real dads are providers. But at the end of the day, these what ifs may not ever be answered, but I know that my hunger motivated me to work harder and to accomplish more. Now, I don't know if I would have had the drive I do if he had been there. So you may ask yourself the same question. But for some of us, daddyless children, this may have been the motivation we needed to excel. Crazy, huh? I was able to persevere and set goals for my life. One of them was to become a lawyer. And this has been one of the greatest achievements that I've had in my life so far. So I guess you can say it helped to motivate me. Tell me your story. Were you poor, daddyless, and driven? Do you think your life would have been the same if your father had been there? If he had been a dad? Do you think you would have been as driven as you are or were if he had been there? Would you have accomplished your goals? So that's the first episode of this podcast. If it spoke to you, please like, follow, and subscribe. But more than that, I hope that you will share what I've spoken about to give you some outline of some of the issues that we're going to be talking about and to recognize some of the issues you might be dealing with. And you're going to share this not for me, but for the kid who's looking for a piece of peace. I thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode where we're going to talk about how common daddylessness is and why nobody's talking about it. I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.